And thank you for inviting me to talk about some of the work that I do at MGH with a very large group of people who you will see a picture of at the end of this talk. So I'm here today to talk about something called a platform clinical trial, what it is, why we might want to do it, how you do it, and the different considerations that we had both going into planning our trial, but also things we learned as this trial has progressed. So the example I'm going to use is from an ALS trial, which I'll talk a little bit about. And hopefully this will be new and interesting and informative for everyone. So I'll start out. This is a clinical trial. I have no disclosures to report. So as I said, what I'm going to do is give you a little background on what a platform clinical trial is, why you might consider it, how they work, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion about all the considerations and things that kind of bumps along the way. So I think people are familiar with this hierarchy of trials, of studies, of where we feel confidence in results. And right there, close to the tippy top, are randomized controlled trials, preferably double-blind randomized controlled trials. However, as we all know, they're not the easiest things to do. A traditional clinical trial, you would enroll people with a particular disease or illness or something. You would randomize them to getting a drug or a placebo or a standard of care, and you would follow them. And yes, there are a lot of different designs to this, be it crossover or whatever. But in general, a traditional clinical trial, you're looking at one drug and one disease. But that can get kind of slow, and there's a lot of incentive to be finding new drugs for some diseases at a slightly more accelerated rate. So that's where these multi-arm, multi-stage trials come in. They are also sometimes referred to as the master platform design. In fact, that's what we usually refer to it as, but this is their official name. And it's a type of adaptive clinical trial. It allows for simultaneous comparison of multiple interventions. And it also can include multiple diseases or multiple subtypes of diseases, with the characteristic of being able to share that placebo group across interventions and diseases. It has a shared infrastructure. It has a single DSMB. It usually also has a single overarching IRB, which, as you might imagine, would be very beneficial to only have to work with one. It's harmonized across all these interventions, so it makes it easier to use this data later on to do other things. And it does also, most importantly, minimize the number of patients that have to receive placebo. There are different types, so that depends, what they're called is depends on how many diseases or how many interventions. So I'll just give you the language. So a basket trial is usually defined by multiple diseases or multiple subtypes of a certain disease, all going into a single intervention with then randomized to drug or placebo. These might be multiple different types of cancers that all have the same genetic mutation. That is a very classical way to think about a basket trial. An umbrella trial, I did not come up with these words. An umbrella trial is a single disease, but testing multiple regimens at the same time. So everyone has this single disease, and they might get randomized into different regimens, and then ultimately randomized into a placebo or an active group. Where usually, but not always, this is open so people know, and this is blinded, so they don't know whether they're active or placebo. So a platform trial builds off of little characteristics of both basket and umbrella trials. And in general, it starts with a disease. The one that I'll talk about is a single disease, but it can be multiple diseases and multiple subtypes. People enroll in a master platform, which is also part of a basket and an umbrella trial. From that master platform, they get randomized into one of the interventions. And then once they're in the intervention, they get randomized into a drug group. The difference between this and an umbrella is that it's perpetual. So as certain regimens or interventions end, we can bring in new interventions. So you can always add new drugs and keep that same platform. So the master platform itself doesn't change, but what drugs are available to new participants in the study are going to change over time. And one of the defining characteristics is that in the end, it's a shared placebo. So you don't have to have as many individual people be in placebos in each regimen, because you can share them across the regimens. As more regimens add on, they contribute to that shared placebo as well. Okay, so this has been going on quite a bit. There's a long history of these trials. I would argue that they were mostly developed in the cancer world. But more recently, there's been a few in the COVID arena as well. So there's some very successful and famous studies that have been going on in the platform format. You could look at them yourself, but like one of the things I would point out, besides you clearly need an acronym in order to have a platform trial, is some of them have built so much infrastructure, like this I-SPY trial. It tested 25 compounds, 3 of which are moving forward with accelerated approval. But when COVID happened, they used and utilized their infrastructure to immediately be able to start COVID treatment trials in this platform structure. So the structure itself is really lends itself to being able to adapt to different things as well. So the question is it a good fit for ALS? So I'm going to give you a one-slide background on ALS. So ALS is a progressive, fatal, neurodegenerative, and neuromuscular disease. I believe our friends over the ocean refer to it as neuromuscular diseases as opposed to ALS. Motor neural diseases. I have a PhD and not an MD. I am dependent on you. Thank you. It results in a progressive loss of motor neurons that control voluntary muscles. That tends to be classified in 2 ways based on the onset, be it limb or bulbar onset. There's many other symptoms having to do, about half the people have difficulties with thinking and behavior, majority experience pain, and muscles that control pretty much everything that we do are affected. The motor neuron loss continues until the ability to speak, move, and even breathe is finally lost. The 10-year survival rate I have listed as between 3 and 13 years. So depending on onset, people with bulbar onset tend to have shorter predictive survivals of 2 to 3 years, as opposed to limb onset, which is closer to 5 to 10 years, but obviously there's quite a range. Up in the corner, apologies for showing a Yankee player in Boston, but we usually refer to this disease as the Lou Gehrig's disease, who is a player for the Yankees who developed this disease. ALS has a huge drug pipeline, partially because there are really not many, if any, available drugs for ALS. So there's many companies working in this space. The history of drugs that are approved specifically for ALS, Riluzole is the oldest, and that was 1995. Edaravone was approved in 2017, and then more recently, an oral version was approved in 2022. Very recently, Relyvrio was approved September 2022, and Tofersen, which is a drug that is specific for people who have a SOD1 mutation, was approved last year. But as you can see, for such a debilitating disease, there really are not any disease-modifying drugs that are available. And they're slow. This is very slow to try to get drugs approved, as many people are aware of. And this quote shows up in many talks, and I've taken it as my own for talks that I give about this as well, which is I lost the privilege of working on the human time clock on January 6, 2018. The ALS clock is a lot faster. So people are really, desperate and wanting some new drugs, and we need to take that into consideration to try to speed up the clock. So in a traditional clinical trial, which is what was used to approve the drugs that I just showed you, you enroll a bunch of participants. Usually it's 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, where you have people on the active drug versus placebos. It can take up to 10 to 12 years to get approval from the start of a study till the end of approval. And usually they're sequential. Like you'll have one trial here, one trial there. They might be competing trials for patients to decide whether or not they want to go into this trial or that trial. And each individual therapy has its own trial. Whereas a platform design, you can actually lower the number of participants because we're able to share these placebos. And it takes, this is based on simulated data and scenarios, but if we think about an effective 30% slowing, it can take 4 years to get those first 10, to go through about 10 therapies. So you could speed up the clock and use less participants. So I'll give you a little overview of how the trial, it's called the Healey ALS Platform Trial. It is centered and run out of MGH at the Healey and AMG Center for ALS, but it is a national study. So I'll give you a little overview. People come in and get consented to a master platform. They get randomized into one of our active regimens, which we use letters, A, B, C, D, E, F. Depending on which regimen is open. Once they get consented to that regimen, and this is all open label, so people know what regimen they're going into. Once they get consented into there, they get randomized into a drug or a placebo. So we do a 3-to-1. So for every 4 people that come in, 3 will be on active and 1 will be on placebo. One of our regimens has 2 doses. They get followed for 24 weeks. With a very structured, the way we have our clinical trials set up. It doesn't matter what regimen they're in, it's the same schedule, it's the same tests. And then when it comes time for analysis, we're able to combine the placebos across all the regimens, and then you're ending up comparing active drug A to all of these placebos. So you're able to increase your placebo group. And then any regimen that's in our trial is required to have an open label extension, where everybody then switches on to the drug. And then ultimately, we keep adding regimens as it goes along. I only have so much space on one slide, so I can't give you every regimen unless I forgot to say, people also have the choice of starting over again. So they can finish 24 weeks of our study, decide to continue on to an open label extension, or wash out for 4 weeks, and then start over again and go into the master platform, and then get randomized to another regimen. They cannot get randomized to the same regimen. They would get randomized to another active regimen. So again, I can't list all of them on that slide. I have them on this slide. So currently, we have 4 regimens that are done, analyzed, papers being submitted in about 2 weeks, A, B, C, and D. E just finished. And that's all I can say, but in the next couple of weeks, I'll be able to say more. And F and G are currently happening at this time. So we usually have multiple regimens enrolling at the same time. We had a moment where the only regimen enrolling was E, and I'll get back to why that was. But right now, if somebody enters our study, they get randomized either into F or into G, and those are still actively enrolling in our study. I will say that A stopped early because of futility. B, unfortunately, did not see effectiveness. But C and D showed promising enough results that the companies are pursuing phase 3 trials with certain outcomes. So in our first 5 regimens, as I said, one of the benefits of this platform design is that we can have shared infrastructure and shared inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and everything, and allow us to really be able to combine the data. So here we have our inclusion criteria, which is chosen obviously by our clinical researchers. One thing that's, I think, somewhat unique to our study is that time since onset of symptoms is 3 years. Many of the clinical trials that have been going on, it's been less than 2 years. They have to have some level of breathing capacity and independence in that regard. They cannot be on assisted ventilation at the start of the study. The duration of our study is 24 weeks, and the open label extension or active treatment extension is 6 to 12 months after the completion of the RCT. We randomize people into regimens using a stratified randomization. So based on whether they are currently taking the current treatments, for A, B, C, and D, it was edaravone and Riluzole, they'll get stratified randomization so that we ensure that we have a balance between what treatments people are on at baseline. We actually continue the stratified randomization into active and placebo as well. When Relyvrio was approved, that was added as well to the strata. So for the first 4 regimens, it was 4 strata, and now it's 8 strata. And as more drugs will get approved, that will probably increase our number of strata. We are 160 per regimen, so 120 plus 40. For reasons that are unknown to me, I didn't mean that in a negative way, but I am not part of some conversations. Once somebody gets enrolled in our study, I'm no longer part of the design conversations. RGF has increased their sample size to 300, bless you. And some of our drug regimens can also have multiple doses as long as they keep to the overall 3-to-1. So we have many endpoints. Our primary endpoint is a functional score called ALS-FRSR, combined with a survival. So we have something called death or death equivalent. So it's either time till death or time till someone goes on permanent assisted ventilation, which means they need assisted ventilation for at least 23 hours out of the day. We have many secondary endpoints: respiratory function, muscle strength, death alone survival, and then many treatment-specific biomarkers. And just a list. We counted, I think there were like 81 at one point, but a list of exploratory endpoints. And by that, I mean other information that we collect that we will be able to use moving forward, be it biomarkers from urine, blood, or CSF, PBMCs, neurofilament light. We have DNA from everyone as well, and there's a lot of biobanking, and of course, many safety endpoints. So how do we analyze the data? So we have a primary and secondary models. The complexity of the platform design is great for screening many interventions. It's great for getting people more involved in these clinical trials. However, obviously, it adds a lot of additional aspects to how we analyze the results. Plus, we also have a functional decline and a mortality decline. So we are working with a group called Berry Consultants. That's a Bayesian shared parameter model that combines both function and mortality. And the ultimate estimate at the end is a shared treatment effect. We tend to interpret it as the percent slowing in rate of progression relative to controls. That takes into account mortality as well. There is an interim analysis plan that occurs every 3 months once 40 participants have completed the RCT. And within that interim analysis, we do have stopping rules. So I have 2 slides on the actual Bayesian model, just to not necessarily dive too much into the math. I see a few people not loving seeing math on the slide, but that's fine. It has a functional component, and it has a mortality component. And the thing that we're most interested in is that theta that is buried within this model. So there is a theta buried within this model, and that is our estimate. So this is how we estimate the functional component. One of the things that makes this model unique for the situation that we have is it has a way to take into account both time effects, meaning placebos that were enrolled years before, and also regimen-specific effects separately. So while we're combining all the placebos, we're not treating them as just one big pool of placebos. There's more information on the papers. We have also a mortality function, which is your standard looking Cox proportional hazard model. And then that theta also buried within there is combined and updated using the priors, and people's contribution to that theta is dependent on whether they died or whether they are still alive. So if they survived the 24 weeks, they contribute to the functional decline. If they reached an event endpoint, they contribute to the survival. And ultimately, it gives us a disease rate ratio where a priori, based on simulations and incorporating the interim analyses, if our probability of the disease rate ratio being less than 1 is greater than 97.9%, then that is considered a success. So for those unfamiliar, This would be the equivalent of a one-sided p-value of 1 minus 0.979. Yeah, so that takes into account all of our interim analyses. We have many of secondary outcomes, many continuous ones, many survival ones. So for the continuous ones, we use random slopes models, repeated measures models, and when needed, spline models. For our survival outcomes, primarily we use Cox proportional hazard regression, but again, when needed, we'll use interval sensory models. These are all pre-specified. And then finally, we use something called the combined assessment of function and survival that the FDA prefers. It is a non-parametric model, basically a joint rank test that does take into account function and survival separately, but in a non-parametric way, which is what the second bullet says. Okay, so let's get to the meat of this, which is the considerations that went into how we do and analyze this study as compared to your traditional clinical trial. So I call this epidemiologic and statistical considerations. I previously referred to this as epidemiologic considerations and statistical solutions because that kind of is how it flows. But I decided to combine it because it really is a lot of competing issues that go in. And I never occurred to me I would spend this amount of my life talking and thinking about placebos, but this has been obviously one of the biggest issues as we're combining them across different regimens. So different drugs have different modes of administration, and that has been very true for our all the 7 regimens that we have right now. One was an injection, one was a pill, one was a liquid, one was a weekly IV infusion, and 2 of them are powders that you put within a drink. So can we really say that all of these placebos are the same? Because we will see different adverse events, because if you have an infusion once a week, you're going to see more infusion-based adverse events in that group than you would necessarily in other groups. It also factors in sometimes into whether somebody is going to consent to being in the study. If they know that they are going to be in a regimen that is a weekly infusion and that is the only one, they might be less likely to enroll in the study. Some drugs do have restrictions, so once they are assigned to a regimen, they are screened for that regimen. So one of our regimens had gold as part of it, so if anyone was allergic to gold, they would fail out of that regimen, get sent back to master protocol, and get randomized into a different regimen. There's not a lot of those, but that does happen. And one of the issues is, can we use placebos that are still going on within those 24 weeks in another regimen? So when regimen C ended, regimen D was still recruiting and still following participants. But does that mean we can only share the placebos from regimen D if they finish the 24 weeks? Or could we share them earlier, and how would that affect our analysis? And then also historical placebos. How long can a placebo be used? So this study was started in, if you can believe it, March 2020. And we have a lot of placebos that were enrolled through 2020, 2021, et cetera. Can we still be using them? Are they appropriate placebos to be using? These are a lot of things that we were thinking about, and we are still continually thinking about. When can placebos actually be unblinded? So if we're doing analysis on a current regimen that just ended, but we've already done the analysis on A, B, and C, how does knowing the fact that these people were placebos factor in on how we're going to analyze E? So when can the placebos actually be unblinded if we don't want the researchers who are still actively doing the study and designing the study to know about those placebos, because those placebos will be used in future studies? So how do we solve that problem? And that really feeds into the publishing. So as I said, our first 4 papers are getting submitted this month. And in those papers, we have table 1 that lists all the characteristics of all of our shared placebos. Can I use those placebos as I design H, I, J, et cetera? They're going to be published. They're going to be made available. We have information up on clinicaltrials.gov about them. is it still kosher to use those placebos moving forward? And that is a question that isn't 100% answered at this point. How do you factor in current treatment use? As I said, we were doing stratification. However, what happens when a drug gets approved midway through your study? So Relyvrio got approved while we were still enrolling in RGE, which means there is a segment of people in RGE that had the opportunity to take this new drug. And while we asked them not to, they are patients before they are participants in the study. And they could still choose to start this drug. So halfway or a little more through the study, we have patients that have started this new drug. If this drug is actually effective, how does that affect our power? How does that affect our analysis? And then we adapt future regimens based on the original regimens. So if we use information from the earlier regimens, which we have analyzed and we will be publishing, what does that mean for future regimens? Because we already know those placebos. And ultimately, and this is the question we get from participants all the time, and rightfully so, can we ever eliminate or reduce the number of placebos? That is one of our ultimate goals. So I put some asterisks now next to things that we did not think of a priori, but have come up since we started. So the interim analysis plan, one of the things that you need to think about is if you have a stopping rule for one of your regimens and you stop it early, that affects those shared placebos to other regimens. So if one regimen like A was stopped early, all of their shared placebos were also stopped early. And what does that play into your power, and what does that play into any bias that might be? And then one of the statistical considerations that we've been dealing with quite a bit is we're not independent. Our participants are not independent because you could re-enroll. So you can have somebody who is active in one regimen and also a shared placebo in that regimen. And how do you deal with the fact that you have people that are more than once in a particular regimen analysis? Additionally, it is a 1 to 3 randomization, which means somebody who completes 2 regimens, there's a 6% chance that they were a placebo in both regimens. It's just binary, quick little back of the envelope, there's a 6% chance. So are they a placebo twice as our shared placebo? And how do we take that into account? And then when we think about OLEs and ATEs, we do a bunch of stuff to take into account that some people choose to stay in the OLE and some people go back. We use a lot of inverse probability weighting and principal stratification to try to deal with that. And then one of the ones that popped up that was not considered ahead of time is, what if somebody's data changes when they do a second regimen? So someone completes a regimen, they go back to the master protocol, we ask them the question of when did your symptoms start, and it's a different answer. Can you update your data with that different answer? Can you go back to their previous answer and use their previous answer? Because there is usually not an actual truth, and this has happened. And what does that really mean? Someone who did a second regimen, I can go back to their original answer, but someone who didn't have a second regimen, I can't. And does that bias does that introduce any bias? So those are some statistical and epidemiological considerations. Many of them we're still working through, and we're coming up with the best solutions that we can. Some of them we've been slowly publishing what we're doing on. But that's more of the theoretical side. I want to talk a bit about the practical implications as well, because it's really great to sit down and talk about what we would do statistically or epidemiologically, but we need to be able to actually put this into the real world. So there's some serious practical implications, and again, the asterisk is to indicate things that we did not think of beforehand. Building the infrastructure, as you might imagine, is quite monumentous. However, it has really positive side effects, which is the example of the iSpy study being able to then quickly transform into a COVID study. When you have multiple regimens starting, ending, and ongoing and publishing at the same time, but a shared infrastructure, you have a lot of people pulled off into different directions. And ideally, you have people that are devoted to different regimens, although that would cause a few problems as well. but there's a lot of discussions about prioritizing what it is that we really need to do within the next week as opposed to the next month. And the one that I don't know why, but I have always found the most entertaining that never considered, we have a big infrastructure on how the drugs make it to the different sites. We have 72 sites across the US. And there's a single central pharmacy that does the shipping and that sort of thing, is when each site enrolls 2 to 4 participants a month. But remember, they don't know if that participant is going to be on drug A, drug B, or drug C when they come into the clinic. They need to store all the regimen active drugs, plus all the placebos in order to enroll a new participant, plus all the drugs for the participants that already exist within the study. We were getting a lot of pushbacks from these clinics because some of the drugs, one of them came in a box that we've described for all of us people who were born before a certain date as a Trivia Pursuit box, like the old Trivia Pursuit game, and you had to take 3 of them home with you. So the amount of these boxes that were stacked in these local pharmacies were getting so cumbersome that they just couldn't, they're like, we can't do this, we don't have the room for it. And many of the drugs, not all, but some of the drugs have to be temperature controlled as well. So the storage of all these drugs across all these regimens was a real big thing that we had to deal with. And then keeping the patients engaged. Thankfully, we have a really big group of people that are involved in patient engagement. One of the other practical considerations, which thankfully does not fall on the statistician's job, which is interacting with multiple different competing drug companies. And what does fall on the statistician is being incredibly paranoid on every call that I have that I know exactly which drug company I'm talking to. And I am only talking about that drug company's data without inadvertently saying something about one of their competing drug companies. So I clear on a practical solution, I clear my desktop and then I only open for that one so I can't accidentally mess that up. And thankfully, I'm not talking with the drug companies as much. The firewall with being the unblinded team, we obviously put a lot of thought into going in. However, there were things that just start coming up as we start doing this on a practical sense. If we are still using these placebos and they still need to be blinded, then any unblinded person cannot know anything about those placebos and cannot contribute to any of the analyses. So how separate we really need to be between unblinded and blinded, and just because a study is done or a regimen is done, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody then gets unblinded. Again, I'm calling this the data management nightmare that is a platform trial. Again, there was a lot of work that went into planning, but things will constantly come up. And I'll show you how complicated it is in the next slide. The potential paths that a single participant can take within the study is kind of mind-blowing to me. So one of our wonderful data managers put this together and tracked a potential participant named Clark Kent and all the different paths he can take. Like, it's not like he can have a choice. We have a single participant who has done all of these because we could re-enroll, right? So I'm not going to go through too much, but they can fail master protocol. There's a lot of, sometimes people time out, go back in, get screened into A, fail A, go into B, finish B, decide to start over again, maybe fail a master protocol at one point or go into regimen E, etc. And this is one person that is in our data set all of these times. And keeping straight all the different potential IDs and all the different paths, and when you can actually use them as a comparison, because technically, if they're a placebo anywhere, they're going to be used as a placebo in all of the regimens. So this is just one person. Yes, it is a complicated person, but how the absolute level of the different paths, I think, was a surprise to us. It wasn't a complete surprise, but it was a surprise. Now, as I said, the infrastructure and what it takes to put on one of these enormous trials is quite immense. So it is a collaboration across many, many, many organizations and funders. a lot of the researchers here, the current drug company partners here, and a lot of the funders over there. I will also add that we have two of the OLEs have branched into what's called expanded access programs, EAPs, which we have received NIH grants to support the EAPs. So we have been making sure that we can perpetually allow participants to be able to access these drugs. Sometimes we turn to EAPs as well. There's a huge governance structure. I don't think anyone necessarily wants to talk about that, but as you can imagine, there's a lot of different people with a lot of different expertise that feed into it. There's over 70 sites across the US that are enrolling participants. They're all part of a consortium called NEALS. As I said earlier, we have one central IRB through MGB. Every site has their individual IRBs, but they could use the central IRB to convince, obviously, for their individual IRBs. But it really is one central IRB, which means the structure of following all these sites and managing all these sites is quite extensive. As I said, we have a wonderful patient navigator team, and what they do is it's just miraculous to me. Interacting with patients and caregivers and the community, keep people invested in the study, keep people coming back to this study, making sure they hear what we're learning from the study in real time, and making sure that we hear from them what it is that they need. They do weekly webinar series for patients and their patient community. I've been volunteered. I've run a couple of them to answer questions about biostatistics and how we analyze the data. And in doing that, learned how different it is in talking to students and talking to researchers than it is in talking to patients. And so that, for me, has been really like a very central aspect to working on this study. I'm going to slowly wrap things up, but this isn't just about getting drugs approved and finding effective treatments. All the researchers at MGH, myself included, are very excited about all this data. It's a data that comes from a very central, regulated design, visits, collections, and investigators. And we're using that data to do biomarker discovery, look at different disease progression measures, how to statistically model these measures. As I said, we have functional measures that work only so well. We have survival measures, and we have all these other aspects to it. And this is contributing itself to the advancement of ALS research. It's just a slide of a lot of the biomarkers that we have, including speech analysis, which has been showing a lot of real good results in tracking decline in this disease. And finally, this is a space that is getting a lot more clinical trials. So across the x-axis, we have years. But as you can see, this is 99 to 202. I don't assume everyone can read this in the back, of how few. The y-axis is number of studies that have been going on in the ALS space. And this is the more recent 2020 to 2023. And a lot of the studies that have been showing up, the colorful band on the top are all the studies as part of the platform trial. So it really is helping to advance discovery of new effective therapies for ALS. And this is just the acknowledgments of the people I interact with on a weekly basis, not the amount of people that are in the study. So as you can see, there's a large amount of biostatisticians, clinical people, and operations. They've taught me a lot. I hope I've taught them a lot. And then acknowledging the dedicated people living with ALS, their families and caregivers, because their passion for this is really what's driving so much of it. And there is a picture on this slide in my version. I don't know why it didn't show up, but imagine a picture of a lot of people. Sorry. So more than just this. So that is what I have to say about platform clinical trials, and I thank you for listening.